Okay, hello, everyone. This is Larry Gordon, our regularly scheduled Five Towns Jewish Times podcast. And, of course, in the Jewish life and the Jewish community, there's never a shortage of vital issues that need to be confronted on a regular basis. We're not, maneuvered or forced to create news or issues. They just come at us fast and furiously. Our guest today for the next 40 minutes is Dr. Norman Blumenthal, who is the Zactor Family Chair, holds the Zactor Family Chair in Trauma and Crisis Counseling, and Director of the OHEL Miriam Center for Trauma and Bereavement and Crisis Response.
Right.
That's a very heavy title.
Yes.
For a person to carry. Mm-hmm. We're speaking a few days in the aftermath of the tragic events in Jersey City, New Jersey, where a couple of people identifying themselves as Black Hebrews attacked or assaulted a kosher grocery on Martin Luther King Boulevard in Jersey City. And killed a young woman who is the proprietor of the grocery store, and a young man who was just in the store buying something to eat. One of the store employees as well injured some others, and of course earlier that day had murdered a Jersey City police officer.
Right.
So shootings are pervasive in the United States. Maybe they are in the world. Certainly, there's parts of the country. Like Chicago, where notorious for multiple shootings in any weekend, but there's something incongruous when it comes to the frum community. Something incongruous about gun violence that just shocks us to our core. You wrote an article that was published in last week's Five Towns Jewish Times on how to deal with these types of traumas, especially when speaking with children, because as you know, as the news has been reporting, there was a school right above the grocery or next door to the grocery store that housed 50 or 60 children. So the potential danger was just mind-boggling. But as we were saying just a few moments ago before we started rolling the cameras, from a news perspective, events like this have a shelf life of a couple of days, whether it's the shooting in Pensacola that killed 3 people on the naval base there, or it's what happened in Jersey City just 4 or 5 days ago.
Right.
So in terms of news cycles, they fade away. They go somewhere. And in most people's minds, though, I mean, what happens to that information? It's not as shocking as the first day we heard it. But what happens to it next from your professional perspective?
So it depends, I guess, if the news item is such a radical change from things that we took for granted. And I think a lot of the recent synagogue shootings are now this so close to home as really just across the river from Midtown Manhattan and very close to so many concentrated Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods, the deliberate assault and the intent to target Jews, and in this instance, to target very visible Jews, Orthodox Jews, who are most noted, let's say, or most associated stereotypically with being Jewish, is, I think, a game changer. And the fact that it was a kosher grocery, it wouldn't surprise me if in the not-too-distant future, a lot of our kosher establishments and commercial establishments are going to resemble those in Israel with guards in the front and checking bags and metal detectors as we become aware that there are fringe groups that have violent intent against Jewish people.
Well, that's how it was in Israel for a long time during the spate of, terrorist bombings in cafes. For years, you couldn't get into a restaurant without having your bags or yourself searched by a security guard, but that stopped pretty much. Now, just if you go into a mall, you need to go through a metal detector. But if you go into a regular restaurant or cafe in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, there's no longer any security guards. I think at one point I read that the Israeli government that was paying for security in these establishments was employing 90,000 security guards around the country. So, but that's not something that we want to do. It's like making a concession towards the bad guys. It's like making a concession. I remember in the aftermath of 9/11, when Rudy Giuliani was mayor of New York, everybody was scared, scared out of their wits. But the mayor said, go about your regular business. Now I was a little suspicious of that kind of advice. But is that what you're supposed to be doing?
So I guess that's easy for us to stay here in the Five Towns, the fledgling Hasidic community in Jersey City, which numbers to about 100 families, and are very much a minority in that community, are feeling very vulnerable. In fact, as we speak, there are members of the OHEL trauma team that are meeting with students in the school and meeting with parents, and a lot of the concern is their safety and the aftermath of this, and especially as they feel, I think, less protected, not having as concentrated a community, but even in concentrated communities, was certainly vulnerable as well.
I mean, this might be a security question that may be beyond your purview, but we want to stick to the psychological aspects, the trauma aspects, and how to deal with them. But if you noticed in the immediate aftermath of the shooting in Pittsburgh at the synagogue, or in Poway, California, there was meetings and talk about security at our synagogues. That stopped, of course. And of course, some shuls have great security. Some of the largest shuls, even in this community, have great security. Some just don't have anything. And now, because a grocery store was unfortunately, tragically shot up in Jersey City, now the supermarkets around here, around town, I imagine around the New York area and other highly populated Jewish areas, are also security conscious.
Right.
But that's also going to probably fade away in time.
Good. We do have, it's very hard to stay in a heightened state of alert on a regular basis. So if I want to remain a psychologist. And so therefore we very adaptively can have that sort of vigilance and intensity dissipate, because it would be a great strain on the body. We know from people who are, let's say, are serving in the armed services or are living in areas where there's constant threat, that it takes a huge toll on them physically and psychologically. So very adaptively, we can allow that, that sort of vigilance, as I said, and heightened alertness to subside. However, I think our mindsets do change. I think if we would regard how we perceive ourselves as Jews, and certainly as very visible Jews in America today, and how we perceived ourselves just a few short years ago, it does feel very different, and I think a lot of people are experiencing that and expressing that.
So I want to get back to that in a minute, but the issue I wanted to address from the outset is that a couple of days pass and it moves away from the central focus of our minds, but it doesn't go away completely.
No, it does not.
Where does it go?
It changes our perspective. In other words, initially, we'll be highly agitated, and certainly we're hearing that from some of the parents and children in Jersey City. And there'll be some of the classic symptoms of difficulty sleeping, feeling very irritable, mistaking harmless situations or people as potentially dangerous. But that heightened sense of alertness, as I said, will subside. But our overall perception and a sort of more pervasive vigilance will persevere and will become normal. That's, I think, what you're alluding to is, in other words, when this first happens, as is with any trauma, we look at it as something that's very out of the ordinary, abnormal. And sometimes we can keep that perception. When we were doing our work after Hurricane Sandy, we were able to say to a lot of the children, this, according to meteorologists, is a 1 in 100-year event. There are other types of dangers that shift from being one which there's this hyper alertness and concern to one that becomes a more sort of low-level, pervasive awareness.
So is that your advice to parents who are concerned that their children are disturbed by what happened, to reiterate to them that they are what I call statistically safe?
Okay, so there are two things. In the immediate aftermath, what we recommended very strongly, particularly to the school, is that there should be some very visible changes in terms of safety and security. Now, that might be advice from a security perspective. I can't speak to that. But it's also for the children's sake, so that they know they're not just returning to the very same context and setting that it was last Tuesday when this event took place. So that's what we're recommending in sort of the immediate way. More long-standing, yes, I think there is a change in our perception, and I think there is a different way in which we operate. We, as I said, it's a very different approach than we would have with a sudden trauma that's highly unlikely to recur. But if we're dealing with a trauma that has an element of recurrence, in fact, when we first confronted this in the OHO team was when we were invited to Houston after the floods. Mm-hmm. And we came to Houston after hurricane, it was actually after Harvey. But when we came, one of the things they said to us, that was their third hurricane in 16 months. Mm-hmm. So we can't say to children that this is unlikely to recur. So actually, when we did the research to see what would be the appropriate psychological response, our best source of data actually came from Sderot. Because in Sderot, there are bombings, and then there's a respite, and then there's bombings. So what would be the psychological approach? And what the approach was by the psychologists who studied and worked with the residents of Sderot was, yes, this can recur, but we have the wherewithal to address it. We have the miklat, we have the code red, we have different methods to contain and ensure your safety. And I think that's where we're shifting. We're saying to the children, certainly the children in Jersey City, but I think children in general, yes, there is a greater danger now. We can't deny that, and you can't hide things from children in today's day and age. But we're taking measures. We do have much more security and much more types of vigilance and awareness than we did in the past. We have synagogues, as you mentioned earlier, for the most part now, are locked and need codes to get in. Schools have security personnel. Mm-hmm. So our message to, I think, the children and to ourselves now is that there is a new danger, a danger that we can't be guaranteed will not recur, but we're taking the necessary precautions, as is law enforcement.
Did you have to have the same approach here on Long Island after Hurricane Sandy?
Sandy was different.
Was there a long-lasting trauma after that effect?
No, Sandy was different because the scientists told us that Sandy is a real fluke. Is not something we can expect to recur. In fact, one of the things we did for the students, because many of the children after Hurricane Sandy were afraid of like just regular rainfall. So we were able to, we actually brought in the Philadelphia Science Museum, came to the schools, and we had a grant from FEMA, so we were able to do this, and had a glass container where they showed the children the difference between a rainfall and a hurricane, like an event like Sandy, so they could see it's very different. That we could do here with Sandy. We couldn't do that in Houston because Houston had recurrent floods. So it was a very different approach. We had to take more like the approach of Sderot to say, yes, floods can recur, but here's what we're doing, or here's what the government is doing, much like what they do in Los Angeles about earthquakes, and Miami about their storms. Yeah.
So do you see your job as imparting and teaching people, children and adults, I suppose, on whether or not to be afraid or how to manage fear?
More how to manage fear and also to trust.
Because fear is ever present in life, I guess, in general, on a daily basis to some extent.
Right, but there's realistic fear. In other words, what we were telling the children was the fear of another Hurricane Sandy is not something we can be afraid of because the likelihood of it occurring again in your lifetime is minuscule. So we're not afraid of minuscule events, or statistically minuscule events. Mm-hmm. However, there are some events that have a better chance of recurring, and those types of events, trust us as the adults and trust the government that we live in, that is still a kind government and a government that protects us as Jews, to take the necessary action to, as much as humanly possible, ensure our safety. So we're not telling the kids, no, these were the last anti-Semites, violent anti-Semites in this country who would want to do this take this kind of action against us. But what we're saying to them is, now we know who they are. The police are pursuing it. They're studying them. There's surveillance. and we're going to do everything humanly possible to make you safe. And also, by the way, to put it in a realistic perspective. We don't want children to think that every person who may look different or maybe every Gentile that they encounter is a murderous anti-Semite. We want them to know that most people are law-abiding citizens, kind people, and people who don't have any kind of ill intent against us, so that they don't have this kind of extreme pervasive fear. But to say to them after all these events, this is not going to happen again, I don't think we can in good conscience.
So the conventional wisdom, Dr. Blumenthal, is that these attacks, Pittsburgh, Poway, Jersey City last week, others in Europe and elsewhere, this is an outgrowth of increasing anti-Semitism.
Again, I'm not here. I'm sorry.
That's the conventional wisdom.
Right.
But anti-Semitism is not something that can be addressed, I believe, as an unexpected, unanticipated attack like Jersey City, and is it imperative that mental health professionals dealing with young people or adults for that matter too, because it's a very difficult and complex subject, teach people or instruct people on how to deal with the possibility of growing anti-Semitism?
Well, again, anti-Semitism from a sociological perspective is not my area of expertise in trying to understand what breeds anti-Semitism at that level and how we can further address it. I think there are people that are more well-versed in that subject. In terms of addressing it with our children, there's one consideration that's very important is that the culture of childhood has changed radically in the last generation. When most of us were growing up, there was an understanding that the adults control what information children know, and they're the gatekeepers. They screen what children know or don't know. It certainly was the case when I was a child, and I think even among younger adults today. With the onset of technology and the proliferation, especially of social media, our children have access to information at the click of a mouse. They don't need adults to inform them, and we're no longer the gatekeepers. So a lot of our work with children is to help them keep the information they gather in the proper perspective and how to manage it. Some people suspect that's why we're seeing such dramatic rises in anxiety with children, because they don't have the naivete of childhood anymore. So I think as mental health professionals and educators and parents have to work on the assumption that our children are going to be aware of some very frightening information, without our being able to insulate them from it. And our job today is to help them manage it, keep it in the right perspective, and maintain a realistic sense of safety and security.
Jews, whether Orthodox Jews or just Jews in general, American Jews, I mean, sometimes I feel that by virtue, we're defined as being somewhat isolated in some fashion.
Yes.
In some fashion, we're isolated by the fact of our Jewishness.
Right.
Not a bad thing. It's just the nature of who we are. Is that something that young people have to become accustomed to? Perceive their Jewishness as being unique in a positive way, and maybe in a more critical way as perceived by others as being different, outside the mainstream, outside the realm of what is everyday life, which is American society life is much different than the regular, traditional, conventional life of an Orthodox Jewish young person growing up, for the most part. So, is it something that you would teach or would impart to somebody about the fact of the matter is we are who we are, and get used to it?
So I think it's fair to say, to varying degrees, depending which subset of the Orthodox Jewish community you belong to, but I think it's fair to say that we really have one foot in each world. We're not totally isolated, but we're not totally integrated into the general secular world. And I think that part of our children's upbringing, I think we're doing pretty effectively. I think that our yeshiva systems, which for the most part provide that combination of Jewish study and secular study, are really imparting effectively to our children that we are both different and both integrated at the same time. And I think the success of the Orthodox Jewish community speaks to that we are today, we have people who represent among the top professionals and highly successful business people and people who have highly placed in government, and at the same time, are keeping Shabbos, are keeping the Yom Tovim, are keeping kosher. So I think we've succeeded in that part. I think what we're more acutely addressing now is how do we integrate this very process of being members of the Orthodox Jewish community and members of American society at large in light of what fortunately is just fringe groups, but becoming increasingly vocal fringe groups and increasingly impulsive, if you will, fringe groups who are now making their sort of irrational hatred for us very obvious and are acting on it more readily.
I don't want to get to other subjects in the time allotted here.
Sure.
But just staying with the Jersey City situation
Sure.
For a moment, the attack was perpetrated by people identified as Black Hebrews.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's not just a person that has some type of vendetta or animosity against Jews per se, but they actually, from what I understand, Black Hebrews, that faction of Black Hebrews is the fact that they object to the fact that the Jews consider themselves to be chosen people, that they, the blacks that subscribe to that philosophy, that they're the chosen people, and the Jews stole their birthright, so to speak. It's the parshas of the birthright that we've been discussing the last couple of weeks. So, it involves like a tug of war on the fringes of Judaism in a way. Is that confusing for kids?
I really don't think that the children that we spoke to or that we've helped process not only this tragedy, but the other tragedies that when we've had to come down and do an intervention, have really been confused, have dealt with that. I think from the child's perspective, there are elements of, let's say, the greater American community that harbor hatred towards us. Many of them, especially those with the stronger traditional education, will cast it in the mold of the Yaakov-Esav conflict, or the Amalek-Israel battle that is an eternal one, which is a fairly healthy way of handling it. It ensconces it in the greater issue of Jewish survival and our role, our sort of mandate in the world. But even there, I think we have to keep it in a realistic perspective. I've mentioned to the children just this past week in Parshas Vayishlach describing the encounter between Esav and Yaakov, and it talks about that they kissed, that they cried. They both cried, and if the Hamek Dover, then the Siv says there that Yaakov cried too, because when the Gentile community is respectful to us and is kind to us, we have to be kind to them as well. We have affection for them too, because they're our brothers. So we have to keep it even if we look at it from that broader historical perspective, we have to keep it balanced.
If society in general was really consistently civilized,
yes,
there would be less problems. It's these people that go off the edges that generally cause the problems. But if a young child or a young adult can absorb the fact that these are aberrations, and unlikely to be repeated, or extremely infrequently, then of course it's easier to move on.
No, we don't live in Nazi Germany. It's
but things are seen in that perspective. If you're a student, if you're a little bit older, I'm not talking about someone that it's a lot of years now since the Holocaust, obviously. But if you're a teenager that had grandparents that survived the Holocaust, and even if you read about it to this day, it's unfathomable what took place and how police forces and government cooperated with the fact, and it's frightening, and it's brutally frightening.
Right.
And if you view these types of things in those contexts, it's the fear exists here, because the age-old Jewish question in this Medina Shel Chesed of the United States of America is, can it happen here? And people will debate you. I personally don't think it can happen here. I think there's too many checks and balances. Even though Congress is going off the deep end, it's only on the impeachment issue that they're going crazy. But otherwise, the checks and balances between the three branches of government and the same structure and local government with police forces and representatives and county and city and state executives, it makes it very difficult for that type of thing to happen, and unlikely that all these official groups are going to someday wake up and decide that, like in Europe during World War II, that it's time to dispose of the Jews.
Mm-hmm. I hope you're right.
I hope I'm right too.
Okay.
I hope I'm right too. Let's get on a couple of other
Sure.
subjects in the 10 minutes we have left. The hot button issues in the Jewish community from a perspective of a trauma psychologist like yourself has been, of course, over the years, and in light of what has been largely publicized in the Catholic Church, for example, where sexual abuse over a series of decades, maybe even a half a century, there are cases dating back a half a century, has really changed the face of how people perceive that. And unfortunately, in modern society, situations not dissimilar to those have seeped into the frum community. And it's very disturbing.
Yes.
It's usually a taboo subject, unlike other subjects that we could discuss more openly and in an intelligent fashion. It's disturbing and it's difficult to deal with. Is it on the increase or is it waning from your experience?
So, not a matter of experience, a matter of what's statistically shown. The impression is that actually adult-to-child molestation is going down. I'd love to say because people are becoming more moral or civil, but I think it's because we are more aware of it and it's being uncovered.
They don't want to get caught.
Right, basically. But in contrast, peer-to-peer abuse is on the increase.
What does that mean exactly?
In other words, children molesting each other or sibling incest.
That's on the increase?
The impression is that that's on the increase now.
In the frum community?
What happened? Well, it's the frum community and the general community. I don't think there's a difference. Although there is a suspicion, again, it's hard to collect statistics on this, but there is a suspicion that sibling abuse is higher in the frum community than the general community. But it depends how broadly you define that. So we're seeing, so there is that change. I guess the good news is that I think it's become almost routine now that schools, in conjunction with the parent body, are providing safety instruction, are teaching children, it's sad that we have to do this, but teaching children to recognize improprieties of the sort and to respond to them, which, as I said, I think is one of the reasons why we're seeing a decrease possibly of adult-to-child molestation. Well,
years ago we never had to do that, like you said, because it wasn't something that was on the agenda in any way, shape, or form. And if it was extreme, an extreme aberration.
Right.
Now, in terms of abuse, being reported, you said that from you said parent to
adult to
child, and outside of the family.
Well, all across the board. No, actually, most sexual abuse is perpetrated by people the child knows.
The child knows.
In other words, the stereotype of the evil person with the curly mustache and the raspy voice living under the bridge, I think only accounts for 10% of, which is still a large number, but 10% of adult-to-child sexual abuse. Most of it is people they're familiar with, family members, teachers, youth leaders, and somebody that they can easily earn the trust of the child.
Conventional wisdom or unconventional wisdom has always been over the years that someone indulges in this types of abuse, has been abused as a child themselves. Is that statistic correct?
So that statistic
accurate?
seemed to have been correct till fairly recently. Some of the more recent statistics shows that actually the majority of those, both adults who abuse children and peers and peer abuse, are not people who have been themselves abused, but a significant number have. And I think it's very important to mention as well, we're not saying that most teachers and most youth leaders and most parents are abusing their children. It's just that percentage of those who do. It's about 90% are those that are known to the child. But the most recent statistics shows that in actuality, the majority of the people who have been identified as abusers were not actually abused themselves.
But what was it? Why would someone that was abused as a child want to abuse somebody? I would think it might be the opposite, considering the trauma involved in it. You don't want to have to impart that kind of pain.
Yes.
What is the psychological idea behind that?
And there are people like that. I know that even from my work clinically, that I've worked with people who were abused themselves and may even have, as a result, to answer your question first, is that early sexual experiences get very imprinted in the person, and therefore sexuality is associated of this kind of adult child or abusive situation. So therefore the urges may be very much in that arena, and that's why it's repeated. But I have worked with some remarkable individuals who were abused as children, who harbor these desires, and yet work very hard on themselves to make sure they never act on it because they don't want to do any harm to a child, and that's an impressive accomplishment.
The same line of thinking also has said, I've heard it from experts in the field, that young people that end up abusing drugs also had this kind of trauma in their early life, more frequently than not.
Yes, a high percentage. Yes,
and the connection is that they're unhappy with themselves and they want to hurt themselves. They're looking to escape from something that's painful to them.
So there could be a host of reasons. They were at a very young age. Part of the problem, what makes sexual abuse so difficult? Let's say, for example, the research shows pretty consistently that sexual abuse is more pernicious and long-term harmful than physical abuse. And the reason for that, there are a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that in a very confusing way, and it's almost impossible to describe with words, but in a very destabilizing, confusing way, there's an element of pleasure because it's a sexual encounter, and the sexual encounter is pleasurable.
And it's confusing.
So you have this merging of pleasure and pain that is just rips you apart. And therefore, there is the self-medication component of substance abuse to calm oneself down, but there's also this confusion about what's pleasurable and harmful. And if you think about what substance abuse also sort of captures that admixture of pain and pleasure, because there's an immediate rush and extremely pleasurable experience, but then long-term consequences can be incredibly painful.
I wonder, is that why you hear people, someone that has been discovered to have been abused by an adult, and you hear that they've been abused from the age of 13 to 19, and you wonder, how could they carry on something like that they were uncomfortable with for 5 or 6 years? Is that because of this conflict?
The sexual predator often has those urges from a very young age and have it down to a science, and they know very well how to engage the person. First, they know how to pick their victims, and they know how to engage them and how to play with their mind. There's usually concurrent psychological abuse. Comments like, you're enjoying this too. You were picked because you're special, and it begets this constant, this kind of almost like romantic-like relationship. And also the victim becomes convinced that they're at fault as well, so therefore they're going to keep it a secret.
I know this is not your area of expertise, but people that rip other people, rip money off from people
right.
for investments, groom them, I've noticed, in the very same fashion.
Okay.
Over a long time from when they were very young.
I'll take your word for it. Nobody's tried to groom me that way because there's nothing much to groom.
Okay, but that doesn't mean they're not going to try.
Yeah, right.
Okay, now secondary trauma. I have a list of things that you can talk about. What is secondary trauma?
Secondary trauma is a fascinating area. There's really two types of secondary trauma. There is a secondary trauma of someone who finds out about primary trauma. So in other words, those of us who heard on the news or read about the attack in New Jersey were probably experiencing...
Can be traumatized
from hearing about it secondhand. Mm-hmm. And the other type of secondary trauma are actually the first responders. the Hatzalah drivers, the police officers, the firefighters.
What about the mental health professionals?
Mental health professionals like us.
You have to deal with some heavy
Sure.
things on a daily basis. How do you absorb that kind of stuff? And
Sure.
How do you deal with it?
So first of all, one is a requirement on our team that if one of the members goes out on an intervention, they have to meet with me or my female counterpart afterwards to process it, because it catches up with you. What's particularly pernicious about secondary trauma is that, in other words, the people that were right there in the vicinity of the Jersey City attack were experiencing primary trauma. The police officer who showed up, they experienced secondary trauma, but it reaches a breaking point, not that one single event, but the 25th. It's cumulative. So you'll have, let's say, a Hatzalah driver who is very heroic, and we need them. Thank God we need them. And this is his 40th pedestrian accident where he sees blood and pain or death. And for some reason, this one gets to him. He's getting nightmares. He can't sleep. He's irritable. And it's not because this single one got to him, but it's each one of the 41 sort of catch up with him. And the interesting thing is that when we work with, let's say, Hatzalah drivers, or for that matter, sometimes we've even worked with a Chevra Kadisha after a very, some of these tragic, horrific deaths. And what happens when we meet with them is that all the last ones they've had over the last few years start cascading into their consciousness. And they're just telling this. Do you remember that one from 10 years ago? Do you remember that from 6 years ago?
It doesn't go away.
Because it catches up. Yeah, it doesn't go away. Trauma
you don't know when it's going to show up.
You don't know when it's going to show up.
20, 30 years later.
Yeah, it's just each one. Now, the research on secondary trauma seems to suggest a sort of what we call a curvilinear response. In other words, the ones most prone in terms of first responders to secondary trauma are not the sort of rookies, not the people early in this field, nor the ones who have seniority, but the ones sort of in the middle. And the reason for that is the early ones haven't seen enough yet for it to catch up with them. The more senior people have sort of naturally developed coping mechanisms so that they can manage it. It's the ones in the middle who are most prone to have the breakdown, and it catches them by surprise. It blindsides them because they don't expect it to come.
So it's a dangerous field. I mentioned here previously in another program that Elie Wiesel told an interviewer recently in a book that for children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, they're probably in a unique position as they are suffering from an experience they never had.
Yeah, I didn't know he said that, but it makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Absolutely. So one more item on your list here that I'd like to hear what you have to say about is what you refer to as affluenza.
Uh-huh.
So usually we talk about people that are adjusting to poverty, difficulty with parnassa, with making a living. But you have a category here of people that have difficulty with their relationship to money because what? They have too much money?
Right. Well, I'd love to have that problem. But no, the affluenza actually is a term that was coined by someone else. I don't want to take credit for it. It was actually a book written by a psychologist, I believe in the 90s, or it was a title of a book. But affluenza actually refers to not just how much money we have, but our relationship to money. In other words, how do we look at material items? How do we look at wealth if we are blessed with it? The attitude towards money more than actually how much you have or you don't have. And that there are some very healthy attitudes. So you can have someone who maybe isn't so wealthy but has a very good perspective on what they own and what they don't own, and are therefore more content or able to manage their money better versus someone might have a whole lot of money and yet doesn't know how to relate to it or doesn't know how to achieve that kind of contentment and can really be more distressed than the person who is less financially endowed.
Are there psychological strategies to deal with that?
Yes, right. I mean, and a lot of them, actually, in that area, you can very much rely on Chazal, who have some very good perspectives. The Ezeho Shia Samech Bechelko type of approach is how do you perceive, or for that matter, nothing out of the ordinary for a psychologist like myself and many of my colleagues, to have people who have had, let's say, a major financial setback and are suffering from it. And this financial setback might take them from being wealthy to upper middle class. In other words, not that they're facing extreme poverty,
right,
but the setback, how can they have, what kind of mindset, what kind of framework, what kind of template do you impose on this change and to make it more tolerable? And
Well, obviously, there are a number of very fascinating subject areas that we could cover. We can probably go on.
All right.
But that's all the time we have for
Okay.
today.
Thank you.
Obviously, life is complicated,
yes,
and there are many difficult issues to deal with on a daily basis. So I think this type of exercise, where we can come into a calm environment and discuss the things that people that may be listening to this or watching this online can perhaps learn something from it and incorporate something into their own way of thinking on how to deal with these complicated issues. And inevitably, if you're living, they're inevitably a part of life.
right. No, a podcast like this is a great service to the community, and I thank you for having it.
Great. So we've been speaking with Dr. Norman Blumenthal, the Zachter Family Chair. He holds the Zachter Family Chair in Trauma and Crisis Counseling, and director of the Ohel Miriam Center for Trauma, Bereavement, and Crisis Response, which covers, I think, every aspect of life as we know it from birth until for many years after that.
That's right.
Thank you for joining us, Dr.
Thank
Blumenthal.
you for having me.